Hey Bozo, I heard you like those games. You know, the ones with the rat and the balls and such. I've also been hearing some select terms you really like describing them with, be it in the context as a critique or as praise. You always fall back onto those few words. The strange thing is though, the way you use them seems vague and easily misconstruable. Thankfully, that isn't you, or most people. That was a dumb strawman I made up which holds no bearing on reality. Except it does. So let's talk about Sonic the Hedgehog. With each recent entry in the Sonic games, there's been a growing group of fans who voice their dissatisfaction with how they feel the gameplay should be designed. They've latched onto two main terms to describe their thoughts. For a Sonic fan, you already know where I'm going with this one. Momentum. And used not as frequently but still prevalent in the discourse surrounding these games, automation. First, let's try to break down what momentum means. In real life, momentum refers to the amount of force gained by an object in motion. More specifically, that but as a result of a progression of events from its mass and velocity. For those who don't know what mass and velocity are, mass is the amount of matter in an object, usually with a close link to its weight, and velocity is both the rate of an object's movement across a unit of time and direction of movement. Oh, and momentum can also colloquially refer to how long it takes for a moving object to come to rest, if Merriam-Webster is to be believed, but I think I'll get into that later. And yes, you're learning physics now. But not anymore though, we're actually done. So, how does this real-life concept apply to the not real-life Sonic games? Well, I mean, depending on what definition we're going with, momentum could be present in almost every single Sonic game ever made. It's pretty hard to get a feel for whatever Sonic's mass might be because he simply does not interact with the environments in the same way that a human being would be able to. Just, obvious, but still. It's clear that trying to apply the laws of physics one-to-one to a video game designed to be fun isn't exactly going to be a fruitful endeavor, though that doesn't mean comparing them in the first place is necessarily a bad idea, I think. With that sentiment in mind, how is momentum used by the fandom? In that context, it's earning speed through skilled play, it's pressing button. But it's definitely not holding down a single button for high speed with the need to resource manage for that ability. Except for when it is. I don't fucking know what momentum in Sonic games is, and apparently neither does the rest of the fandom. Until recently, I would have said the closest thing to a proper definition for momentum in Sonic might as well be the absence of a boost button. But as I've already brought up, that also doesn't seem to be the case. I guess it could be the physicality of the movement, but that's something I'll explore more later. And again, that's not necessarily what that word means. Again, I'll get into it later. It makes automation seem a lot more straightforward in comparison. To some degree, it kinda is. Automation isn't really a term with much background in physics and stuff, so no bastardized physics lesson this time. So let's just jump into the Sonic-y context for the word. Basically, it's supposed to refer to the segments within stages in the games that, for lack of a better word, are cutscenes. Short cutscenes with spectacle, and with little to no control given to the players until the segment in question has ended. Sounds simple enough, right? Well, the more you look at the levels across the games for moments of automation, the more it becomes clear that it's a bit of a nuanced topic without clear dividing lines between what is and what isn't automation. Enough so for various online debates to wage on for at least a few hours. So what the hell do I mean by all that? Let me ask you a question. Yes, you in particular, regardless of your stance on any of this. You know what I said about automation possibly being a more nuanced topic than what a lot of people think? Is it possible there's a single term that can not only single-handedly supersede both momentum and automation, but is also a much more nuanced way to describe the elements at hand that those two terms try to? Well, I don't know. Let's go analyze some levels for some reason. Before I get into the intricacies of each stage I'll be discussing, I think it makes sense to dissect how the levels in each are fundamentally designed, just to get a feel for things. In classic Sonic, stages are typically broken up into multiple pathways vertically that can intersect with each other. The lower paths tend to be hazardous but easy to stay on, while the higher paths are less hazardous but a lot harder to stay on. There are exceptions to this, but generally this is what the level design's like in these games. For a more blatantly obvious example of this kind of level design, look no further than Aquatic Ruin from Sonic 2. I mean, the bottom half of both acts are literally underwater. It's harder to get much slower and challenging than that. As I said though, the lower sections of the stage can be completely avoided by sticking to the higher routes, and as a byproduct, completely avoiding all underwater sections. Another trademark of these games is the constant inertia felt through both the physics and the accompanying level design. In the second act of Emerald Hill, if you spin dash through this loop on the high section, you'll lose some speed from going uphill, but gain and maintain high speed as you go down it, flying through the second half of the level straight to the boss, with little input required from the player's part. Of course, you do still need to actually make it up to that point, which requires a little more than down plus mash jump input to carry out. Even still, it's the first zone of the game, so I think it's fair for it to be on the easier side of things. Those roller coaster-like sections primarily exist to really sell the sense of speed in the games. It's the kind of thing they like to show off in the ads. While you could remove these sections, and that may not necessarily make the games terrible, it still takes away what I think is a major part of why the levels are so thrilling to go through, even if they aren't the most nuanced thing in the world. Chemical Plant, like a lot of other classic Sonic zones, follows in the footsteps of the same multi-tiered level structure, though you tend to see a lot more weaving in between higher and lower parts of the stage, while still remaining on the same path. But that isn't the most interesting trait about this zone. No. What's really interesting about Chemical Plant is the introduction of a certain stage gimmick, that being the dash panel. Speed panel, or dash pad, speed booster. Whatever you want to call it, this is the first appearance in a Sonic game of a non-tangible stage gimmick that gives you a burst of speed. Very specific description, I know. That might sound functionally pretty similar to a spring, but the main difference between the two is that springs can only be interacted from the side it faces towards. Classic Sonic, at least. Essentially, you can't place a spring in the middle of a straightaway and have it flow seamlessly. The one peculiar thing they both have in common is that they lock your directional controls for a brief moment. I imagine that's like that to give you some time to react to the change in the direction so you don't accidentally slow down. Also, did you notice how I said it locks your directional controls? Well, even at the exact moment you touch a spring or dash panel, you're able to immediately jump out of it and regain full control. An instance where that quirk of dash panels in particular is useful would be in Chemical Plant Act 1. Normally, after going down the loop on the lower path and hopping over the spring, there's a dash panel that sends you forward through the same path. However, if you jump right at the incline of the ground here, you can use the speed from the dash panel to jump over to the higher path, which actually saves some time over running straight through it. It may not be something easily intuitive, hell, it's not even the fastest way to clear the stage to begin with, but it's still something that feels really cool to pull off. That, in my opinion, utilizing the possibilities of the movement against the terrain is a core part of what makes these games so fun. It's not the only fun aspect about these games, of course, but nevertheless, it's something that makes me keep coming back to them after all this time. Except Sonic 1, because that one fucking sucks dick. Also, since I don't know where else I can mention this, tubes. You break open the tops, you go soon. Don't have any control over it, you just kinda wait. Sometimes up to 10 seconds. This may be foreshadowing something. Maybe. Exhibit C. Sonic Adventure 1 Dreamcast. 1998. Sega. So how do you take all that and translate it into a fully 3D environment? Well, alright, look at this. You, gradually accelerate from a standstill. That checks out. Inertia seems okay, though in the air you kind of just come to a stop if you don't hold forward. Jumping is a bit floaty, and you lose quite a bit of forward velocity from it, which I guess is fine. Spin dashing is... what the fuck? As is evident, Sonic Adventure is a bit of a departure from the earlier games, even when playing through Sonic's story. I'm gonna stick to talking about Sonic's gameplay in particular, because all the other characters play even more differently than how he does, because Dreamcast Technical Showcase launched Ballpark title. Looking at the first stage in the game, Emerald Coast, we can already see a lot of modern Sonic staples coming into play in the level design. The homing attacks have been added as a part of Sonic's base moveset to try and make moving around in 3D space easier, and later for chaining it across groups of airborne enemies to reach otherwise inaccessible areas. For the first time, dash panels have now been incorporated as a stage-agnostic gimmick, similar to springs, spikes, and such. They tend to be placed right before large inclines and loops, to help the player maintain the speed they need to cross, and to just generally keep them on course. Sonic's stages overall are more dictated by where the level designers want you to go than before. Not to say that there isn't any amount of player-driven stuff still. You can go off the beaten path to look for monitors and things, and there are some instances of higher and lower paths, but it tends to be scaled back in comparison to the many branching paths from the classic games. Barring Casinopolis and Speed Highway's final section, which were clearly made with Knuckles' treasure hunting in mind. Also, unrelated, but that snowboarding section in Ice Cap has gotta be one of the jankiest fucking things I've ever seen in a video game. Entirely irrelevant to all of this, I know. I just really wanted to bring that up. There are also a lot of scripted segments and levels, usually tied in with gimmicks like dash panels, which take control away from the player, like, for example, loops. In earlier games, they acted as barriers that you needed enough speed to pass through. Both Sonic Adventure, you'll always be flung through it with a fixed speed boost as soon as you get close enough to one. You don't even need to hit a dash panel for the speed boost. It just kinda happens. But you know how it is. It's Sonic Adventure for the Sega Dreamcast, and no amount of scripting will stop you from completely breaking any aforementioned scripting, which will almost certainly end in the loss of a life. Jokes aside, for being one of Sonic Team's first fully 3D games ever, and with having to translate the level of speed inherent to Sonic games into the third dimension, they did a pretty good job at making the first mainline 3D Sonic game not suck complete ass. They even made it pretty fun, even if it does deviate from the feel of previous games. And like I brought up earlier, this game has a pretty interesting, albeit definitely not intended, tech of its own, with how you can spam the spin dash for easy to redirect constant speed, which lends itself well to traversing stages in unconventional ways that aren't typically possible. Oh, and just generally being able to move faster as well. Shit, you can even uncurl out of a ball by pressing the action button, which also halts your speed if you're in the air, the latter of which being pretty useful for situations where you want to minimize your air time because of your previously built up speed. So it kinda goes hand in hand with heavily utilizing the spin dash. Regardless, stages overall funnel you more into what they want you to do compared to earlier games, and that's a design trend that would continue in following mainline entries. Speaking of which... over the years, the more level design oriented gameplay over more player oriented gameplay would become even more prolific. The next game, Sonic Adventure 2, was an early example of the games leaning even harder into that, with some of the most straightforward and simple level design in the series. That isn't an insult, by the way, it's actually pretty fun for the most part. Introducing more QTE-like mechanics like the now instantaneous Lightspeed Dash, and the newly added somersault for rolling under tight spaces. Sonic Heroes had the whole trio swapping thing going on, where a certain type of character would be heavily encouraged or outright required in order to pass an obstacle, like needing a flight character soar up to a high platform, or a speed character to fling off a pole. Sonic the Hedgehog 2006 was a video game, but also something of a return to how Adventure 1's stages were structured. The core Sonic gameplay of the mainline series around this time was a bit all over the place, to say the least. But that would change with a certain title which would finally solidify Sonic level design / structure / overall game feel, with its impact still being felt almost 15 years later. That game is Sonic the Hedgehog for the Leapfrog DJ.
You spelled magic. Spell the word credit.
Sonic Unleashed was the first 3D game to really establish the boost as a gameplay mechanic, something that was brought over from Sonic Rush, but with its own quite different take on the gameplay in comparison. We've now got the boost, which I literally just mentioned, now being able to move at a speed so high, which may have been partially responsible for the creation of Sega's own Hedgehog engine in the first place. Quick stepping, for when you need to quickly step to dodge any incoming obstacles. Sliding, which originally debuted in 06, has been refined into a more quick and seamless way to run under tight spaces. Literal QTEs in the form of whatever those launcher things are called, and a bunch of other things as well. Oh, and you can't forget about the 2D sections as well, which actually allow for a whole new type of gameplay by trading in the Z-axis for more intricate and vertical level design, the latter of which probably wouldn't work as well from a standard behind-the-back camera angle. I mean seriously, could you imagine trying to play through something like this from this angle? By now, 3D Sonic's roller coaster-like level design has come into full swing, dash panels fully locking your control, springs bouncing you in a fixed arc and speed, etc. While there is still a little bit of that more positioning-reliant terrain manipulation like in the classic games, it's definitely taken a back seat. And that definitely will not be the growing source of conflict between Sonic fans about how much you get funneled through the level design in a very specific way being a good thing or not using terms to describe the way they feel about it that are typically okay at best and incredibly vague and confusing at worst. Sorry if that was passive-aggressive. Hey, look at that. We're at the part where I talk about my own Sonic design hypothesis that I've been dancing around for the past minutes, which is also my reason for making this video in the first place. It's something I think does a better job at describing the design elements that momentum and automation try to, within the small scope of Sonic community buzzwords. Let's call it determinism. No relation to Undertale. Or deterministic, determined, whichever form is more grammatically correct in a given sentence. If that feels a bit vague to you, let me give an example of what I mean. Let's say there are two ledges. You, the player, start at the leftmost ledge, and must platform your way to the right ledge, which is the goal. You have a very basic move set, consisting of the ability to move left, right, and jump. Nothing less, nothing more. In the gap between the two ledges is a floating platform. A single jump can't reach far enough to cross the gap, so the only way to proceed would be to jump onto the floating platform, then onto the right ledge. This is what deterministic design is at its core, its most primitive form, the lack or lessening of choice that is rooted in the game's design. But let's say your moveset was expanded a little. You could move through the room in the same way, but you can also do this. Or this. Or this. Or this. The level design has stayed the same, but these additions to the moveset makes navigating the level more variable, thereby making it less deterministic. But the level design is still really basic, so let's make it a bit more nuanced than two ledges and a floating platform. While it's still just an A to B stage at the end of the day, we've managed to make an incredibly simple challenge into one that is fundamentally more variable, for both how you can use your own movement options as the player, and which paths you can take to reach the goal. Are you starting to see why I analyze Sonic level design for like 10 minutes? Picking out moments and stages when you lose an amount of control, whether it be through simple level design or your control outright being taken away to an extent? It's because those are all examples of deterministic design at play. Obviously, a whole-ass Sonic stage has more moving parts to it than a single-screen region, but you can still see those principles at play, particularly when it comes to the level design. Does that mean the extent of determinism of Sonic games is something that exists on a binary? Well, no, it doesn't. Another reason why I picked out those moments and stages was not to treat them as 100% equals, because they aren't, but rather to analyze what I think is an underlying similarity of how they take away your options in stages. Not taking into account glitches, because they're glitches, obviously. I wanted to look at the nuance of how deterministic elements, minor or major, can be good, bad, or even just neutral depending on how they're implemented and or what context they exist in. Analyzing Sonic level design through the lens of what things are automated or not feels incredibly limiting in comparison, and as I said earlier, how the line gets blurred between what's automated and what isn't because of the somewhat ambiguous nature of the term in that context. And momentum lacks any commonality to justify it being used so haphazardly, other than maybe more physics. though that kind of falls apart when you see people using it to describe Sonic's gameplay in the adventure games, which are already starting to use a lot of the deterministic design elements you see in the recent games, such as homing attack chains. Like, okay, I get it. A specific image comes to mind when one thinks of more physics. Maybe something that involves inertia akin to the classic games and rolling down slopes for big speed. But I think it's good to keep in mind that that kind of game feel only works well when it's carefully designed and generally fine-tuned to make the player's speed not feel too out of control. This one level lost word can suck my balls.
Pun entirely intended.
In short, when utilized well, determinism is a tool that can enhance the gameplay experience into something way cooler, or to craft highly tuned stages that constantly flow from beat to beat like a rhythm game. In fact, you might be starting to realize that determinism is a concept that applies to many different types of games. Mario, you got your fire flowers and raccoon leaves, which are incredibly versatile, but you also got your invincibility caps, which are much more situational in comparison. I'm not gonna go into that too much, because it's way outside the scope of this Sonic the Hedgehog video, but I still think it's necessary to bring up examples of determinism showing up in other games too, for people in that Sonic Grind 25/7. I know what you are. Fundamentally speaking, Sonic is cool as fuck. Cooler than someone like Mario, at least. And that's something that translates into the gameplay, with level design that at first tried to capture the feeling of an amusement park ride, as put by Sonic the Hedgehog 1's level designer, Hirokazu Yasuhara, a trait that would be expanded upon throughout the rest of the series. It's something in the classic games that's as important as the speed you maintain without input, and really, the general commitment to the speed you gain. This is more of my own opinion, but personally I don't think the latter, the exact feel of the classics, is what makes a Sonic game a Sonic game. Don't get me wrong, it's a really fun and unique type of gameplay, but I don't think the way future titles iterate upon it, with their use of deterministic elements, makes them lacking in identity or anything like that. They're simply just different. And whether or not you like what they're going for is more up to your own tastes. Does that make them perfect or immune to criticism? Of course not. I still prefer games like Sonic 3 and Knuckles and Mania over most of the 3D games, purely for how much more consistent, engaging, and overall refined they are. There's nothing wrong with criticizing moments that are frustrating or that utilize deterministic elements poorly. If it feels less like you're being cool as shit, blazing through a stage, and instead waiting for the game to let you play again, then that's kind of a problem. Though that could really go for any extremely deterministic section of a stage if you speedrun it enough. But again, determinism can really enhance the feel of Sonic games when used well, even with moments that play out like cutscenes, because of how cool they make you feel. Feeling cool and doing cool stuff is what defines the Sonic games, in my opinion. This is cool. This is also cool. This is really cool. This is one of the most frustrating games I've ever played. Get that shit out of here. But the delicate balance of the most extreme deterministic elements is what keeps it engaging, and makes it great, if you can get past the trademark 3D Sonic jank, which was especially present in the games before Unleashed. On a side note, I feel like we've seen what classic Sonic looks like at its peak, but I don't think we've ever seen adventure or boost style gameplay at its peak. Whether it's cause of jank or inconsistent quality, it still feels like there's a bunch of untapped potential for those styles to be really great. Also, sorry if this video's come off really rambly and all over the place. I'm just trying my best at articulating things I've thought about for months now. Sonic's gameplay is a lot more nuanced than what a lot of people give it credit for, and that's something I'm trying to hone in on with the concept of determinism. It's my own personal take on describing a design philosophy prevalent throughout the stages, an overlapping commonality between the use of seemingly unrelated stage elements. It's probably not a flawless concept. I imagine other people could spot some issues with the idea of determinism, but I couldn't think of anything more fitting, so here we are. Hypothetically, if a new Sonic game gets shown off, and people lose their shit over dash panels that are generally inconspicuous, thinking it's gonna be like, I don't know, automated Garajo. Well, I don't know about that, man. It's actually a lot more nuanced than that. A couple dash panels doesn't automatically mean the game will feel too scripted. It might be more of a chemical plant type thing, TBH. Other clips show that the game's actually pretty lenient on that stuff, and the developers have said they studied the classic games to closely replicate the feel of them, which likely means most differences present may come from having to build the game around simultaneous 4-player co-op, which could potentially present some problems, but that's not something we would really know about until people finally get their hands on the game, TBH. I don't really know where to go with this anymore. If there's something you can take away from this, it's that Sonic is cool. Deterministic design is nuanced, and extreme examples of it aren't always bad. Superstars is looking subjectively pretty fun. Hope it's good. Also, Sonic Forces is low-key fun. I don't care what people say.